Yeah. So this prophet generation then, speaking things forth, getting into late life, later adulthood, like elderlyhood during winter, my first statement when we started this podcast was, older generations, older people want to preserve their past, what's come before. And I can just imagine how desperate that's got to feel when all the good stuff's in the past. And right now it feels like stuff is not as good. And I mean, it may not be bad, but it just doesn't feel as good. It doesn't there's a lot of feeling stuff coming in here for each generation. And so there's a grasping and trying to preserve what came before, a reset. No, we've got to go back to these values. This is what is the thing that's important. And that prophet voice that they had in their young adulthood isn't working the same way. They're hoping that they speak forth something in a prophet way and say, this is how we've got to be. And it doesn't feel like everybody's listening anymore. And so I think it causes things like holding on to power in positions in like politics and leadership and some of those things, like in executive branches in certain companies, because they're trying to preserve what once was. And it's really hard to let that go. And I'm sure that's a really difficult thing for many boomers to face.
Yeah. Yeah. And I can sympathize. I really can. I mean, it's got to be difficult to, I think particularly the prophet generation right now, the boomers, they're also experiencing something that I don't know if previous prophet generations had to experience, which is the ending of one just unquestioning paradigm or way of looking at reality into another one, which is very destabilizing. And that's leaving modernism for postmodernism.
Yeah.
That happened during autumn, right? That was part of the unraveling, is that we're bridging modernism into postmodernism. And when you're raised in a modernist world, there are some things you just take for granted. You just take a modernist perspective for granted.
Yeah.
And the idea that postmodernism became a dominant paradigm during fall, and then now it's definitely here to stay in winter. In fact, it's going to be a major thing that is fought over in the next saculum, who gets to set the tone of how we see reality. And in a postmodernist, sort of landscape, it's like a game of Hungry Hippo, who's going to get the most marbles. And you can see that right now. Everybody's smacking those little hippo paddles as fast as they can to try to get as much influence as possible to push it into the next saculum, regardless of whether or not they're conscious or aware of it at all. You can tell it's almost like we're trying to establish what's the next 80 years going to look like. What's going to be the high, right? In the last version, like you said, Red Scare was there. There was that was the time period where they start putting 10 commandments in all the schools and in the buildings, like official government buildings.
You're talking about when the prophet generation was little kids in the 1950s. Mm-hmm. The previous generations are trying to put a lot of things in this new spring saculum that's starting up.
That's right. And there's a version of that coming up for us, right? Who gets to be the quote unquote 10 commandments in City Hall, right? So as this generation is sort of completing its cycle of influence, how much of the modern world that they believe should be preserved is going to be able to be pushed into the next saculum?
Yeah.
And that's a big question mark. We don't know.